place a period where God has placed a comma, for God is still speaking. And we know that this is true. We know that this is true because there are so many personal testimonies of people in church after church around the entire nation speaking of how God has worked in their lives. So many men and women and children telling us of how God moved through them and God spoke to them. And this is very powerful. Some of these are just put goosebumps on your arms type of testimonies. And I imagine that in this room, there are many of them. One testimony that stood out in my life was of this woman who was struggling over her son's drug addiction. And her son's drug addiction was powerful, had a hold on him and on the family. And he did all the things that you imagine somebody under a strong addiction would do, and the mother suffered. And she prayed on a daily basis, over and over again, for her son to recover, knowing that there's very little that she could do, knowing that it was all out of her hands and beyond her skill set. She prayed. And then she describes that one day she was just spaced out. She was just looking out into the sky, not really thinking of anything. Her mind was blank. And in that state of blankness, where someone could have come and told her she won the Powerball, she would not have heard it. She said that all of a sudden, she heard God. Not a booming voice, not a voice that came from the clouds, like in today's passage, but she heard it in her heart, and that God told her her son would be well. She had been suffering from terrible anxiety due to her son's illness, and she said it was lifted like that. Immediately, she felt better. And it was a magical moment. It just transformed her, and she just knew that her son would be well. And she knew that God had spoken to her, but she really couldn't explain that to anybody else. It was just one of those personal things. Well, years later, many years later, her son eventually became sober. He became clean and dry and was able to transform his life and lead a healthy and new life. This is one example among millions of how God speaks to us today, of how the message of God is being heard. Too often, we look for God in the powerful. Too often, we look for God in manifestations that are beyond. And often, it's just right there next to us, which is why Sunday morning is so important. Sunday morning is so important because we feel the Spirit of God moving through the community, moving through us, the people. And often, it's the people that are next to us that help us walk a little bit closer to God. Sometimes when God needs to speak, He uses our voices. When God needs to work, He uses our hands. And so when we gather as a community, we say it as a matter of faith that God is with us, but also because we know it. God is with us. And often we go out into nature, into the sky, go out into the woods, go out to the beach, and gaze upon the clouds. And we also feel there the divine touch of God. I have to tell you that I've been with you now for 4 months, and there are no magical sunsets like they are at Pass-A-Grille. Pass-A-Grille has the patent on magical sunsets for the entire state of Florida. Sometimes as I'm driving up the Bayway, right as the sun is setting and the sky is just lit up with God's artful finger, streaked with pink, and the clouds are just puffy there, my breath is taken away. Well, one of these days I'm going to end up having a car crash up there on the Bayway, and when it happens, you'll know that it was Guillermo once again gazing at the clouds, trying to find God. But there is something very so magical about the clouds. And we read it today in the Scriptures. In the Scriptures it said that a cloud descended on the disciples and on Jesus, and then God spoke. Well, let's just be clear. That is biblical language. In the book of Genesis, in the book of Exodus, and in many other Old Testament books, God is represented through the cloud. And back when the Israelites did not have a worship center like ours, and they would worship out in the open, they would say that the Spirit of God moved with them in the form of a cloud. And as Moses was leading the people out of the desert, often a cloud in the form of a pillar was in front of them. And so the whole image of God as a cloud was known. It was known by the gospel authors because they knew their Pentateuch. They knew their Tanakh. And so consequently, it is no surprise that we have God descending as a cloud and then speaking. But that whole beautiful moment of feeling God and the divinity of God with the clouds is with us today as well. It's part of who we are. And when we recognize the divine around us, it is a sign of spiritual maturity. Too often, the cynics around us make us doubt. Too often, the cynics around us make us second guess. But when you have an open mind and open heart to the presence of God in your life, you see God everywhere. You see God in those around you. You see the presence of God in your children and grandchildren. You see it in the community, but you see it in nature as well. I am a sky and cloud gazer. I'm one of those people that just loves to take a look at clouds. And I want to share with you a story that I have that was actually transformative for me. A few years ago, I was stuck in traffic, and I was stuck in the worst kind of traffic. That is Miami traffic. Anybody here been stuck in Miami traffic? Okay, then you know that it's bumper to bumper. And not only is it bumper to bumper, but then they're honking. And they're honking their horns, and you're going like, nobody's moving. Why are you honking your horn? That does not help. But nonetheless, there I was, stuck in traffic, and I just kind of just blanked out. I just was just looking out of the sky, not really paying attention. And I knew that when the cars around me would move, I would move along with them. And all of a sudden I woke up. I woke up even though my eyes were open because I saw this cloud in front of me. And the cloud had the sun, the setting sun behind it. And it was illuminating it from behind. And it created a halo effect. And in that halo effect, I could see this cumulus cloud growing. It was a hot day full of humidity, and all that humidity was just soaking right up into the cloud, and the cloud was growing. And I know all the science. I too watch Bill Nye, the Science Guy. And I know exactly what's happening. It was explained to me years ago, back when I was a kid, but I marveled. I completely just marveled, and I could not help but think that the presence of God was a part of that. That whole divine moment was doing something. And I was so moved by it that I just had to lower my window and go to the guy next to me stuck in traffic and try to get his attention. Now, you know exactly how that went. Then I'm going, look, there's a cloud. And the guy lowers his window and goes, yeah, whatever. But I lift it up as a perfect analogy. It's a perfect analogy about spiritual awakenings. When we have our aha moment, when we have our nirvana moment, when we have our communion with God, it is so hard to transfer. It is so hard to, if we could just transfer it through reading, the world would be so illuminated. If we could transfer it just by telling stories, the world would be so enlightened. But it doesn't work that way, does it? We need to experience God. And it's not until we experience God that we get an understanding of what God is calling us to do. It's not until all of a sudden we start to change our lives. Season of Epiphany is ending, and the season of Lent is starting. And the words we get from God is to listen. Listen. Listen to Jesus. For if we listen, we just might see. If we listen, we just might understand. If we listen, we just might get along just a little bit better. If we listen, we might experience the love of God a little closer and become the people of God. Amen.